In this video, I get claustrophobic. I pull this out of my rear end. Rear axle. And I say goodbye to something after almost 20 years. Welcome back to my 1996 GMC Sonoma Minitruck build. In the last episode, we played around with some paint mixtures and sprayed the bottom of this frame. If you missed that episode, check it out with the link above. Now the next step is to follow the exact same process as I did previously to clean, prep, and paint the frame. And I want to do the same thing with the rear axle. And to make sure I'm just not showing you the same type of content over and over again, I'll turn some days into minutes. There's some welds left from the tie-ins between the frame and the frame table, so I start with using a flap disc to grind them down. I then use a roll-lock disc to sand it smooth. Since I've been experimenting with paint a few times on the frame, I decide to respray everything, and I sand down any existing paint with a 220 grit disc. Now to address the rust. I did a pass with the wire brush when the frame was on its side, and now I'm doing one last pass to make sure I get any remaining loose rust. For the new metal, I sand it down with 60 grit to make sure there's good adhesion with the paint. I then wash everything with the cleaner degreaser and a drill brush. The next thing I want to do is clean the rear axle, same process as I did with the frame, and get it prepped for paint as well. But I have a bit of a challenge. First off, this cover is not sealing properly. You can see over here, gear oil has been seeping, and if I flip it upside down, it starts seeping from the top. Now with the yoke down, that's not a problem. So I know it's definitely with the cover. I've already taken off the bolts, but I'll show you why it's not sealing properly. Now you can see this cover is really rusty, and I have another cover. So I'm not going to be using this, except for maybe still some mock-up. We'll see. Maybe I'll start bringing the new cover in now. You can see it's rusty under here, and you have a lot of this gasket sealant that the last person that opened this up had put there. And a lot of the rust has transferred to the sealing surface, and I did my best to scrape off as much as I could. But you still see some of that sealant there. So I do want to clean up the air, especially over here where it won't be sealed. So I'll need to make sure there's paint to protect it. Now, my plan is to rebuild this. I'll be keeping the same gears, just replacing the bearings, but I'm not ready to do that quite yet. That's going to be a lot of work, and I'll do that down the road. But if I try cleaning this up, a lot of it's going to fall in. And what I'm worried about is some of the rust will get in between the gears even when I'm just pushing the truck in and out of the garage. So I want to make sure that I clean up as much as I can, and to give me some space I'd have to remove the differential, and I'm not quite ready to do that, but I think it makes the most sense. Get this out, then I have access to anything that falls down. I could clean out the case. I'll keep the yoke in, but take out the differential. Then what I can do is tape up the sealing surface and get it all ready for paint. So I've never done this before. I know there are shims that put pressure side to side load. So as soon as I pop this out, the shim's gonna come out. I know it's gonna be a little tough to get back in, but it's a challenge. I gotta push myself, and that's what I'm going to do. So I have a bit of a problem here. The trick is to put a wrench on one of the ring bolts at the top and then turn the yoke, and it's gonna, as it's turning the yoke, this is supposed to pop up. It's hard to grab this just by the side of the yoke, so you want a wrench on the yoke bolt, but I don't have a big enough socket for that. And it's getting late, so I can't grab one at the store, so I'm gonna have to do that tomorrow. I have one more try at turning this. I have a bit of a donut thing on my yoke. Maybe it'll pop up, but if not, then I got to do a little bit of shopping. No, that's not gonna work. And I don't want to clean this up with the differential in here. It's a locking diff. I know there's a lot of moving parts in here, so I want to make sure that that stays clean. I do need to figure that out. But while I wait, let me put the cover back on and at least clean the rest of the axle up. Just like the frame, I start with some wire brushes, then clean a degreaser with the drill brush. I've been cleaning the rear axle for a good number of hours. I probably have 3 hours in here, and I thought I was done, but two things came up. One, I forgot to weld this area here. Now, I wouldn't be able to get all the way in, but on the outside I have it mostly covered, but this area is just tacked. There's still a lot more that I can get a torch in. So I got to do that because I can't weld it after I paint it. And then up in the corners here, there's just a bunch of grease. So I think I'm going to rotate it so I have better access there to clean it. The risk is I might leak some gear oil, so then I'll have to do another cleaning around it, but I got to get the grease out. So a little bit of setback. It's going to take me a little bit longer than I planned to do this, but I just got to keep on moving on. Got that area welded, not perfect, but it'll do. I also cleaned it with a toothbrush and degreaser, and also the areas that were underneath here that still had grease, same thing. I used the toothbrush and the degreaser to get it all clean. Now with everything clean, the next step is to use some metal prep, which is the same process that I used in episode 13 and 15, but the reason why I'm pausing here is because the bottom of the frame is painted. And in the last episode, when I used metal prep and I actually let it dry on some of the previously painted areas, it caused some discoloration and I think a little bit of pitting. So I want to make sure that I don't do the same thing for the bottom of the frame that I just painted. So I have this bucket of warm water, and my plan is I'm going to spray on the metal prep and I'm going to wipe down using a rag soaked in the warm water to wipe down underneath to make sure I neutralize as much of that product as I can. It's my first time doing this, so we'll see what happens. All right, the frame is all treated, and I think my plan to wipe off the excess on the bottom worked. When I peeked underneath, didn't look like there was any staining or discoloration on the paint. And the rear axle, that's all done with metal prep, as you can see. And as I mentioned before, I'm replacing the cover, so I didn't bother treating that at all. Next up, I gotta get ready for paint, which means I need to make a makeshift paint booth. You can see I already started a little bit over there, but I need to actually fully enclose it this time. When I painted the bottom of the frame, I only did half because of the way I was spraying, but now I'm gonna be spraying top, left, and right, so I need to fully enclose the frame and the rear axle. So I'll get that set up and I'll bring you back when I start mixing the paint. Now, as you can see, I put up my makeshift spray booth. It's not the best, but I think it's going to do for what I need to. Because the frame is low to the ground, I don't need to worry too much about up here. Here's my plan of attack. I want to also paint the axle, so I think I'm going to do that first since I really don't have much room. Now, I can move a lot of this away as I spray and it won't come down and touch it. I'll make sure of that. So once I get the initial spray here, then I can move to the inside of the frame. I'm also going to put a coat of paint on where it's already painted. I've already scuffed that up and that's ready to go. And then lastly, I'll do all of the outside. Now this is going to be the biggest area that I've sprayed in one set, but I think it's going to take a couple of mixtures to get through it all. So my plan is I'll mix everything, spray it down, get through the paint, mix up some more depending on what's left, and then continue on. Now my camera is my phone and I don't want to overspray on it, so I'll leave that out of the spray booth and I'll come back once everything has been painted. Okay, it's the next day after I spent maybe an hour and a half spraying, so it's my longest session ever using the spray gun, and it was a lot more work than I thought it would be. Also, I used the same ratio as I did in my previous episode, which was a 4 to 1 to 1. So 4 parts paint, 1 part hardener, 1 part thinner. And things started to get a little thick with the paint as I was going through. And I think it'll show up on the camera. You can see it was dropping little tiny globs of paint. Since this is the chassis and underneath the body, it's not the end of the world, It's my first time doing this sort of thing, so I'm still learning and I can't be a perfectionist. Otherwise, it'll take me another 20 years to get this project done. So I'm gonna still leave it to dry for maybe another day, but there are still some projects I can do. I'm also leaving the makeshift paint booth up because there are some other parts I want to paint, and you'll see shortly in this video what those parts are. There's one more thing I want to say about spray painting, and that overspray is no joke. I read about it, I heard about it, I ignored it, and the stuff gets everywhere. The way the spray booth should be set up is with 2 fans, intake and exhaust, and some filters there. I didn't do that. It's additional cost. I'm taking the risk, but I also didn't think it was going to be as bad. Now, again, this is the chassis. The garage isn't the best looking garage, so I'm not too worried about what the floor looks like. But if you want to make sure that your garage stays pristine, invest in a couple of fans and some filters if you're going to set up your own makeshift spray booth. I start with removing the diff cover bolts, then the bearing caps. With the proper size socket, I attempt again to free the differential, but it isn't easy. It took a few tries and some courage, then finally it started moving up. But it was still tight and I had to find a way to pry it further without damaging it. At first I tried to use a rubber mallet to see if I can coax it side to side. Then I start using pry bars while being careful to minimize any nicks on the mounting surfaces. I started to get more aggressive and use some shop towels to reduce damage, but it still wouldn't budge. And I thought, screw it, I'll deal with any damages after the fact, and I was able to get a pry bar underneath the bearing race and seat. With more force than I was comfortable with, the diff started to move. Now a bit of wiggling and no regard for nicking the bearing seat, I was making progress. Then I was able to get under the bearing and pry it up. Success! As you saw, that was a bit of a struggle, and mainly because it's my first time ever doing it, so I like to take things slow. I get nervous doing things for the first time because I don't want to get to a point where I damage something that I can't repair. And since I already have this painted and all the links at the tabs, the bag mounts on, I don't want to have to get a new rear end case because I'd have to build this all over again. So a couple of things. Once I got it partially out, I had to use some pry bars just to kind of wiggle it the rest of the way out, because the shims are the original shims, which are more like spacers. They're really big. In a rebuild, there's going to be multiple of these, and it's a little bit easier to take a couple out to give it more ease to come out. And so I was going again slow with that, and I did do a little bit of damage marking on here. I'm hoping it's okay. Like for instance, you can see a mark here, but I didn't press on there. So that was there from factory. I don't think this was ever rebuilt. But I'll show you in a second why that's not a problem. Over here, you can see a bit of marking. That I could sand smooth a little bit, but that won't be a problem either. Again, I'll show you in just a second. But over here, you can see there's some marking when I put the pry bar in and I was pushing it this way. This, I have to make sure there's nothing proud. It doesn't feel like it's up, but I will still, when I rebuild this properly, I'm not doing that now, but I will put a little bit of fine sandpaper and maybe get the old bearing race and just kind of rub it a little bit, almost like honing, just to make sure it's not proud. And as I just mentioned, there's a bearing race. As long as the bearing race can sit in here without being pushed up, it's fine. So if it's pushed, any of these marks are pushed down, it's not going to make an impact on the bearing race itself. Now, these marks here, here's the bearing cap, and if I roughly put in the spot it needs to go in, so you can see this mark isn't quite of a problem, and then over here, maybe just a little bit. So again, a little bit of sanding so nothing's proud. If it's dented in a little bit, that won't be a problem. Next step is to get as much of the oil out. I have an oil syringe that will make this job easy to do. The oil out of the way, I tackle cleaning the diff cover mounting surface using a ceramic stripping wheel. The paint has had a few days to dry, so I'm not worried about any dust getting in the paint. It's all clean, but there's a bit of pitting left over that the gasket will have to handle. Who wants to see a mistake from 15 years ago? Of course you do. This is my diff cover from before. Now I did clean the inside, and I'll show you why. It's because this is the diff cover I bought 15 years ago, and looking at the shape, this is more rectangular, this is more round. This is for, I think it's a 7.6 inch ring rear end. This is for an 8.5 inch ring rear end, which is obviously what I have because it came off the truck. So this will not fit. Now I'm gonna put one on order, but if I need to cover up the diff before that, that's why I cleaned off the surface. So that way I don't have any rust hitting the now clean surface of the differential housing. I guess 15 years ago me just didn't know there was a different size of the rear axle. So I'm getting ready to paint again, and I have almost everything prepped. I just need to close off a little bit of this makeshift paint booth. I know it's not perfect because of all the overspray I saw, but I don't want to get any more overspray than I need to. One of the things I'm going to do is spray the spacer as well as the upper link that connects to the diff. And then the diff itself, as you can see, because I didn't have the right cover, and actually because I am spraying these guys, I wouldn't be able to get the cover on anyways because the bolts are too long. I actually need the spacers. I taped this off, and lastly I have where the jack stands were, so I need to paint that. And I'm planning on rotating this a little bit so that the input moves around here. That way I can spray a little bit better where I had trouble getting into some of the gussets that are on here, as well as that spot I just showed you where the jack stands were. So now I just got to close up a little bit more, mix up some paint, and get started. Okay, it's the next day, and I got the spacer and the rear upper link bracket all done. It's painted, it's dry. I'll probably give it another day before I actually pull it down. And then the rest of the rear axle has been painted, so all is good there. One thing I want to show you, and I knew this would happen, I just didn't know what the result would be. I did not cover up any of the frame for any overspray from spraying these guys. So here you can tell they're really shiny, but the frame itself is now looking dull. And I actually don't mind it. Again, all this is going to be covered. Maybe over here it's going to be a little bit visible. Now you can see some marks here. I don't know, I must have put a hand on it or something like that, but I'm not worried about it. It's not a show vehicle. If it's got a little bit of character from that, it's just from the learning experience. It'll just remind me that when you're painting, you got to worry about overspray, or if you don't care about overspray, you got to make sure you don't touch anything while the overspray is still wet. But like I said, I like the look and the texture that it's given it. So again, I'm not mad about it. It's a learning experience, and I just wanted to share that with you, especially if you're going to follow anything that I've done. I want you to go in eyes wide open that anything that's not covered at all is going to get overspray on it. Now, I'd be lying if I say I'm not getting claustrophobic being in here with all the plastic sheets up. So first thing I'm going to do is rip them down, and then I got to take a little bit of a trip. The next step is to get the rear suspension painted, and I need to get the bushings out again. My friend has a press, so I pack everything up to go there. I also pack up the front lower control arms and some parts to get sandblasted. The press didn't work on the lower control arms, so I used the sock and hammer method to get the sleeves out. Don't mind the mess. And have I mentioned that I'm getting claustrophobic? I almost forgot. Before I took out the bushing sleeves for the rear arms, I marked the length of the arms on plywood using a bolt and hammer, then a marker around the bushing. Since I have parts everywhere, I use the plywood and metal horses to create a makeshift workbench. Using a mini pry bar, aka a flathead screwdriver, I pull off the bushings. And I'll repeat that for the rest of them. I then remove the threaded end and the jam nut, rinse and repeat. Next up is the wire brush, sanding with 60 grit, and then a bit of cleaning. Alright, everything is prepped and ready for paint, and I decided to hang them all, and to make it easier so I have to hang only 4 things, I decided to thread in the threaded ends Now on the lower links, I couldn't thread it in all the way, so I just taped off some of the thread, whereas the upper links I was able to thread in all the way. So that's good, everything's set up there. Also, one of you guys asked why I didn't use an epoxy primer on the frame, and my answer was, well, TrimClad is a primer and paint all in one, but also I wasn't sure how it would react when it's sprayed on top of primer. Now, after I looked and read on the can, and it said you can spray on top of paint as long as you sand it down to remove the luster. And effectively I did that anyways on the frame, so I don't know what I was saying on that second part, but the first part being it is a primer. It did get me thinking. Now I don't have an epoxy primer, but I do have a self-etch primer, and I am going to be spraying onto bare metal. So I'm going to do a little bit of experimentation, and I'm going to use a self-etch primer first, and then I'll spray on some of the TrimClad. We'll see what happens. The 4-link bars are painted and the results are okay. There's a few areas where there's a little bit of runs that I'm not 100% on, but overall the results are okay. They are suspension components. They will mostly be hidden, so I'm not going to bother respraying except for a couple of areas which were at the bottom that were hanging low. Just because of this makeshift table that I had, I couldn't get the spray can underneath, and I'm gonna have to spray those areas. The challenge that I have is I want to start assembling all this because I want to also get the rear axle assembled. I want to get this on the frame before it gets too cold and starts to snow, and based on the forecast in Toronto, the snow might be coming in a few days, so I don't have much time left. On the can, it says I have to wait 48 hours before I recoat. It's been less than 24 hours. So what I decided to do, I think I'm gonna sit on it for another day. I have to anyways. And I'll decide tomorrow if I just respray it or if I assemble everything and then maybe mask things off and respray it a little bit later. The next thing I'm going to do is work on the rear axle. But before that, if any of you have any suggestions on how I should be painting my suspension components, please leave them in the comment section. I still have to do the front suspension, and a bit of a spoiler alert, the front suspension is going to come in the next video just because of the timing that I have right now. So put them in the comments, I'll have a look at them, and maybe I'll make some adjustments when I get to the front suspension. It's time to reinstall the diff. Make sure everything is clean, especially the bearing seats. I drop in the diff, making sure I don't pinch any of my fingers and that the bearing races are in place. Next up are the spacers, and I notice a burr that needs to be filed away. Once that's done, I install it as best as I could by hand since the other spacer is already in. And with a mallet, I get the spacer in a bit more, but the ring and the case are making it difficult to push it any further. Try using wood to help, but the fitment is so tight it just chips away at the wood. I then use a piece of aluminum to get it all the way in. With a bit of persuasion, the spacer is in. Next are the axles, and I have to remove the pinion shaft first. I reinstall the brake backing plate on the passenger side only since I still have the brake drum for that side. On the driver's side, I had to cut the drum apart since it was completely seized when I was taking the truck apart. First I install the passenger side, then the driver's side, C-clips, pull back on the axles, and then the pinion shaft goes back in. With the diff and the axles back in, the next step I can do is actually put on the new cover. But I have a bit of a problem. It's not painted. The other one that's wrong size was painted on the outside, so I thought that all the replacement ones would also be painted, but it's not. So not a big deal, just is going to take a little bit more time because I now have to clean, primer, and paint it. Okay, I didn't show you the process since it's the same of what I did with the link bars, but I primed and painted the cover. Just need to let it sit overnight, dry a bit more. Again, not the best results, but it will stop it from rusting, which is what I'm trying to do right now. I also took the liberty to spray the ends of the bar links that didn't have a good coverage. Very interesting, it crinkled. So I'm gonna have to redo them at some point in time, just not now. My goal is to get the frame off the frame table and the rear suspension on. I have to do some of that outside and it looks like my window is tomorrow afternoon, because after that we could be getting snow. Oh, and one thing that I missed, and I have the old cover just to protect it from overspray and dust. Before I forgot to put the bearing caps, they are on now. So I have to wait till tomorrow to put the new cover on the axle because I have to wait for it to dry, and I can't put on the 4-link bracket on the rear axle until I have the cover. So there's a little bit I have to do right before I get to push everything out into the driveway. So the time that I have now, I'm gonna do two things. One, press in the bushings on the 4-links except for the 2 areas that I just painted. And the second thing is I'm gonna get everything prepared for tomorrow. So clean up a little bit, get the frame table on some wheels so that when I'm ready, finish up the axle, push everything out, and get the frame off the frame table. To install the bushings, it's the exact same process as I did in episode 11. Again, please don't mind the mess, and have I mentioned that I'm getting claustrophobic? Lube up the bar end, lube up the bushings, and press them into the bar end. Lube up the sleeve, and use the vise to press it in. Then I use my template to adjust the length of the bars, and I repeat the process. Well, it's the day to get everything mounted. I only have a window of 2.5 hours to get everything done, so let's get to it. I clean the diff mounting surface with brake cleaner, install the gasket, then the new cover, then the spacer, then the bracket. I torque the bolts down to 20 foot-pounds. I sadly have to take Jacques Villeneuve away in anticipation of saying goodbye to something else. Move the cab and the frame table outside, get the tires on the axle and the axle off the stands. Back to the frame. I rig up the engine hoist to the frame with straps, lift it up and try to balance the frame as I pull back the hoist, praying I don't have the same result as I did with the cab. Get some jack stands in place to set the frame on. I roll out the axle and start to connect the 4-link arms. Now it's time for the airbags. I have to lift up the axle a bit to get the airbag bolts on, then I air up the suspension and remove the jack stands. We push the frame table into the garage and take it off the dollies. And with the help with my wife, I lift it up against the wall and have to say goodbye to it. I know this video is getting a little bit long, but I feel like I owe you an explanation for the title of this video, as well as the significance of this moment. I know saying goodbye to a piece of steel that's just made up of carbon and iron might not mean a lot to a lot of people, but to me, this signifies the start of my fabrication journey. It was almost 20 years ago that I used a chop saw for the first time to cut this tubing. Almost 20 years ago, I used a MIG welder for the first time to weld this up. And it's almost been 20 years that I took the truck apart, put the frame on this, and it's finally separated. I did not build this in this garage here. I built this in another garage in my previous home. And I had my friend, when I moved here, bring his crane, the same friend from episode 13, to bring the frame table and the frame welded together over here. So this is a really big moment and a big deal for me, which is why, yes, it's still here. I'm not really saying goodbye. I still have to figure out what I'm going to do with it. I'm not going to be using it again, so I'll probably cut it up at some point, maybe reuse it for something else. I don't know yet, but while it's still here, I'm still saying goodbye because it was part of this truck build for half of this truck's life. It's a 96. I took it off the road in 05. I took it apart in 06. It's 2024 right now. So it's basically lived half of its life on this frame table, which is wild. Also means that I was really prioritizing other things in my life over this truck, but now I have the opportunity, and I'm grateful for that, to spend a lot more time on this truck, and I want to get this driving in the springtime. Is it going to be road legal by then? No, there's still probably some things I need to do, but my goal is to get it on its own, under its own power, in and out of the garage, up and down the street in the springtime, maybe late spring. that's a bit of the backstory on the frame table and the significance. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that like button, and we'll see you next time when we'll be working on the front suspension. Now let's leave on a high note.